Ken, what's on your radar?
Well, there's a lot of talk right now about Russia invading Ukraine, sending the military-industrial complex supporting establishment into a frenzy. They gasp with horror, "Oh no, we can't let this happen." But the reality is they would love nothing more. What better way to justify spending billions more on defense than a perceived Russian threat? Not only that, but Russia is the boogeyman we get to blame for all of our problems. If they actually make a move into Ukraine, it will seem to legitimize those claims. And believe me, we will be hearing about it nonstop. Democrats will be pointing the finger once again at the Russians when they lose elections this coming fall. "Oh no, it wasn't our mandates and crushing of schools and businesses that caused it. It was obviously the Russians. And look at how bad they are. They invaded Ukraine." They'll say this fully knowing most Americans know nothing about Ukraine, its politics, or its demographics. And warmongering Republicans will be chomping at the bit, pointing at Russians' growing influence in Syria, Iran, Venezuela, and China to prove they are an enemy we must continue to spend billions of taxpayer dollars to counter. Meanwhile, average Americans worry this could mean sending troops overseas and entering another war. But the reality is, if Russia does annex parts of Ukraine, and that's very possible, the U.S. won't and shouldn't do anything about it. Everything we're hearing is just noise to continue supporting political agendas and to keep money flowing into the defense sectors. First of all, Ukraine is a new country with very little history of national independence. Throughout its existence, it's pretty much been an area controlled by Russians. And because of its close historical ties with Russia, its population is heavily Russian. Some parts, the majority, 1 in 6 Ukrainian is actually, some parts, the majority, 1 in 6 Ukrainians is actually an ethnic Russian. 1 in 3 speaks Russian as their native language. For a portion of the Ukrainian population, Russia is viewed as a source of shared history and culture. For others, particularly ethnic Ukrainians, Russia is viewed as an oppressor. Most of the ethnic Russians and Russian speakers live in Crimea and eastern Ukraine near the Russian border. Now, Russia is not going to launch a full-on invasion into Ukraine. If Russia does enter Ukraine, it will be only to areas which are dominated and controlled by those ethnic Russians and native Russian speakers. Now, because of this, they will be met with virtually zero resistance, except by Ukrainian soldiers. In fact, many will view them as liberators and will be cheering them in. And as we've learned from Afghanistan, if the people are waving in and cheering the opposing soldiers as they enter the area, then there's no point in us even attempting to counter it. The support of the people in question is kind of important. And this is exactly why we did nothing after Russia annexed Crimea. The Crimean people, who were overwhelmingly ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking, welcomed the troops. And when asked if they'd rather be a part of Ukraine or Russia, their response was overwhelmingly in favor of Russia. Again, you can't win a war if the people don't support you. Obama wisely left it alone, even though he took many personal hits for it. Now, for Russia, the motivation to annex Crimea and the parts of Ukraine currently in question isn't just because they want to unify ethnic Russians or honor these ethnic Russians' request to separate from Ukraine. For Russia, it's about national security and the growing threat of NATO. Now, NATO was never meant to expand into Eastern Europe, and really it could be argued that the existence of NATO has been unnecessary after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was set up to counter the Soviets, and with the Soviet Union gone, why do you need it? Western Europe no longer feels any threat that Russia is going to try and take them over. Nonetheless, NATO has continued to exist and expand, and the latest talk of expansion includes bringing Ukraine into NATO. And Russia is not going to tolerate NATO bases and soldiers right up on their border. Now, one way Russia has been able to halt the expansion of NATO has been to have pro-Russian leadership in Ukraine. However, in 2014, rather than allow the duly elected pro-Russian president to finish his term until 2016, there is evidence that U.S. officials, at minimum, supported, but perhaps even facilitated, a coup to remove the pro-Russian president in favor of a pro-U.S. one instead. They took advantage of a moment of civil unrest in Ukraine to make the swap. The cause of the unrest was that much of the ethnic Ukrainian population, who views Russia as an oppressor, was upset that the pro-Russian president had favored Russia over doing a deal with Europe. After the coup ensued and a new U.S.-backed regime was installed, the ethnic Russians were dismayed, with parts breaking into civil war. Russia took the opportunity to swoop in and annex Crimea, sending a signal to the West that their meddling in Ukrainian politics and the attempt to align Ukraine with Europe and NATO was unwelcome. But the U.S. hasn't backed down, and neither has Russia on this issue. Russia has continued to tell the U.S. to leave Ukraine alone, that adding them to NATO is an issue of Russian national security. The U.S. has continued to ignore Russia's concerns and marched ahead anyway. And a lot of this is about economics and alliances. Europe, particularly Germany, is becoming increasingly partnered with Russia, especially for energy. And Russia can supply Europe with cheap natural gas. Europe's increasing reliance on Russian energy makes the U.S. uncomfortable because it threatens U.S. alliances, especially on other foreign policy issues. As Europe cozies up to Russia, the U.S. might find European nations less likely to join in on U.S. conflicts that may be proxy wars with Russia and more likely to remain neutral instead. And we're already starting to see this. Germany has cautioned the U.S. and others to rethink sanctions they might be looking to impose on Russia over the current conflict in Ukraine. So this just brings me back to where I started. All of this is just theater. No matter what Russia does, the U.S. isn't going to do anything about it and really can't without the support of the people in these areas and without the support of the important European allies we rely on. We're going to keep hearing about this in the news, with Democrats using it to blame Russia for all of our domestic problems and Republicans using it to paint Biden as weak the same way they did with Obama. It's a political win for everyone in Washington. And it's even a win for Russia and the people in these areas who would rather be with Russia than Ukraine if they had to choose. Actually, the only loser is Ukraine. They're being used as a political pawn for our political games, when in reality, it's in their best interest to be friendly to their neighbors. They're instead almost in a hostage situation, and worse, being forced into civil unrest. They're reliant on U.S. funds, and as a new developing nation, they certainly can't afford U.S. sanctions. So they're stuck continuing to do and say whatever it is each administration in the White House wants them to say and do. And if it were up to them, they'd have good relations with both Europe and Russia and the United States for that matter, but they're not being allowed to because larger, more powerful countries have a political agenda, and that's the real tragedy of what's going on. So, I mean, look, if Russia comes in and takes these areas of Ukraine, which, by the way, have been under control of these Russian separatists, those who want to be part of Russia. Like I said, they're Russian people ethnically, they're Russian speaking. They're wanting to join Russia. They've already gained control of this area. So Russia would just have to swoop in and actually claim it as part of Russia. If that happens, what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to go to war over this?
No, God, no. I hope not. I mean, that's why this is all. Right, it's ultimately pointless. Like, we can be as mad about this as we want. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't want Russia to expand, but we're not going to do anything about it. This is a conflict between nations that we cannot be involved everywhere. We are not in charge of the world. We don't get to tell other countries what to do, and we're not going to have World War III with them or with China. We're just not. We shouldn't. It would be insane. It would be insane to put significant lives at risk over something like this. And I think they know that, so they're going to do whatever they want, and we're going to, shake our finger at them. But
Kim, you alluded to this being political theater, and I'm curious how you think this is going to be weaponized by one side or the other in midterm seasons. What is the end goal here from the people who are making this the story du jour?
Well, of course, Democrats are just going to say, look, Russia's the bad guy. So I think that they're just going to use this, not necessarily as the actual talking point for campaign season. They're not going to say, look, they took Ukraine, but they're just going to continue to say Russia bad. We have to counter Russia. We have to stop Russia. They meddle in our elections. They're going to, I think, hone in on that quite a bit, and just continue to kind of play that card of, if we don't stop Republicans, then Russia wins somehow. And look at all the bad things. And they'll kind of point at all the bad things that they claim Russia is doing. This one's tough to say is a bad thing. I mean, I personally am a big proponent of democracy. I think Democrats claim they're for democracy. The people in these areas, like in Crimea, for example, which has been annexed by Russia, overwhelmingly voted to be part of Russia via referendum. They voted, it was like 95% wanted to join Russia. They didn't want to be a part of Ukraine. Doesn't their will matter? Same thing with these areas that are being annexed, that are being controlled right now by the separatists they're technically Ukrainians, obviously, right now, but they want to be Russians. They want to be part of Russia. Doesn't what they want matter? Or are we just going to ignore that? And I think we're going to ignore it. And of course, Republicans will use it as a more war. They'll just be pounding the war drum.
Yeah, that's the problem. I mean, and because the media is so hawkish, Republicans just want to look for any reason to call out something the administration's doing. And then some Democrats are very, like you've said, very anti-Russia because of the legacy of 2016. So there's this confluence of factors that would push Biden in a more hawkish direction, or that are exerting pressure on him to do so, even though I think foreign policy is perhaps the one area where I personally kind of approve of his instincts to not be involved. But it's a shame he faces so much pressure to be involved anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what ends up happening, but for sure, Russia, I just don't know why we're still obsessed with Russia. I mean, the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is gone, modern Russia today, they keep pointing at Putin like he's, they're trying to turn him into somebody. But whether or not you like Putin is kind of irrelevant. The Russian people like him, and he's not a threat
not like the
to
ones
Europe.
he's putting in prison.
Well, of course, but no, the people don't like anybody who's putting anybody into prison. But the bottom line is that he's not trying to expand. He's not looking for. He's not actually trying to expand. Europe's not afraid of him. Let's put it that way. They're trying to partner with the guy. Yeah. So we're just continuing to beat that, Russia, Russia, Russia drum.
Yeah, well, if that's a prescription for midterms and election season, then that's a prescription for a lot of people on both sides of the aisle staying home. Thank you for that, Kim, and we'll have more Rising after this.